Welcome to part 3 of our series called Promise, the Journey to Jesus, where we're taking an excursion through the first 3 quarters of the Bible called the Old Testament, which is really the elongated story of the promise of Jesus. In it, we have God's promise to Abraham. We've looked at that in week 1. We have God's promise to Moses. Joel taught on that. And now Israel. Specifically, actually, today, God's promise to David and what it is that looks like. We're going to talk more about that. Really, so far, actually, what we have been doing is looking at God's promises to us. And in the first week, we looked at suffering and the promise of rewarded faith. Then Joel talked about perseverance and the promise of rewarded obedience. When we do what it is that we're asked to do, there's a reward that comes for that. And then this week, I get to chat about character and the promise of rewarded love. Now, I think I like this one so much because I struggle with this one so much. I do. It is difficult for me. Probably because it has taken me so freaking long to actually understand the importance of this. Although I had an encounter with Jesus at a youth retreat when I was 14 years of age, I didn't actually realize that although I was going to heaven when I died, if I lived like hell today, that the consequences would still be real. And so as a result of that, those years from 14 to 25 were hard. Although I believed in God, I just lived like I didn't. I was a lying, impatient, out of control, angry addict, living for selfishness and manipulating people around me to get what it is that I wanted. And it took my beautiful wife, Jody, in a last-ditch effort to save our marriage, to drag me to church. And 15 years ago, we walked into what is now called Connect Church. And we began to heal. We began to hope again. We began to repair our relationship. We began to repair our relationship with God. We began to align ourselves with God's calling on our life, with his purpose for us. And although it's been work, a lot of work, it has also been very little to do with us and a lot to do with God in our life. Mostly it's just been Jesus' grace, his mercy, his forgiveness, his encouragement, and that has made all of the difference. For any, and to be honest, for any of the changes that have come into my life, I just boast about Jesus. He is so cool. I think that's why I love the key verse for our series. We boast in the hope of the glory of God. Not only so, but we boast also in the glory of our sufferings. Because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character, and character hope. And hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. See, even though I believed in God, even though I believed he had a call for my life and a purpose for my life, my character was so poor that I just kept spinning off course into a life of directionlessness, selfish ambition, which is no life at all. And God's calling is a necessity in our life, but our character is also key. See, our calling leads us towards God's call and best for our life, but character keeps us on the path towards it. See, God's calling leads us towards something special, but our character keeps us in the center of God's will for our life, keeps us on track to achieve our calling. Yeah, but what is our calling? Some of you might be saying, I just want to know, tell me. Well, you got to figure that out for yourself. We'll help you if you continue to journey with us at Connect Church. But each person has to figure out what it is that God is calling them to with their life. But I can give you 2 of them, 2 callings that you should be focusing on. Number one, we're called to God. That our primary calling as followers of Jesus is by him to him. That he is wooing us towards him. He is willing us to him. That he is, even in fact, if you are here this morning, you have begin to hear that calling. That he is just constantly wanting us to be in relationship with him. He wants us to know that we are loved and cherished. That at our core, he created us for good. He is wooing you. He is calling you to him. And then secondly, that we are actually called to live for God. To follow his leading towards a life of purpose. This is our secondary calling. Primary, we are called to God. Secondary, we're called for God. Considering who God should be to us as Lord of our life, as the King of Kings, that perhaps maybe we should actually make him that in our life as well. That everyone, everywhere, should think, speak, live, and act entirely for Jesus. It's hard. See, wherever we find ourselves, God has called us there. That you are sent ones. You are sent out for something truly special. A life of purpose, a life of love, a life of servanthood, a life of direction, a life in the center of God's plan for your life. And our calling leads us toward God, but character keeps us on the path. We see this over and over again in the book of Samuel, as we just saw, where the story of the first kings of Israel is illustrated for us, and we meet Saul, and then we witness all of the stupid things that Saul did, and we're like, why would you do that? And then we meet David, and David's story was so key for me, especially when taking over leadership at this church from the last leader who was here. His name was Brent, and he was an amazing, gifted leader. Talented. His messages were always relevant. They spoke right to me. He was this great kind of visionary. He moved his family all the way from Calgary just to plant this church. Did he have faults? Yeah, he did. He had lots of them, just like me, just like all of you. But I owe so much of what God has done in my life to his obedience, his faithfulness. It blows me away every once in a while. So before I took over from him, David's story of how he took over from Saul was so key. And there are several ways in which David's story actually shows us character traits that we need to employ, that we must have in order to stay on the path that God has for us. Because these character traits will help us become more like David, who was a person after God's own heart, which is pretty cool, like David was called. That we're called to live out our calling, whatever that might be for you. Some of you are called to ministry inside of your workplace. You are called to ministry inside of your family. You are called to ministry inside of your sports activities. That you are called to go wherever it is that God sends you and be on mission for him. And these 5 character traits, these 5 things will actually keep you on the path that God has for your life. So, first, it's going to require patience. That is the first one. David was anointed as Israel's king when he was just a boy, probably in his early teens. And yet it wasn't until he was 37 that he got to actually begin doing what it is that he was set apart to do. 37 years before he was named king of Israel. Now, having to wait a couple of decades because waiting for something that you were promised that's rightfully yours had to be difficult for him. But the existing king, Saul, he spent a fair portion of his time just figuring out ways to kill David. That was his goal. And he wasn't a very good king. And yet David realized that someone else's lack of character is no excuse for you to not have some. And so as a result of that, he didn't try to make things happen. He waited patiently on God's timing. that he had to wait for God to begin to do what it is that he had planned for his life. And really, this forced David to stay on the run, hiding in caves, fleeing to other countries. At least twice, David had this clear opportunity where he could have, in self-defense, taken Saul out, but he didn't. He knew that God had his best interest at heart, and he trusted him enough in order to wait for his timing. David wrote this. He said, "Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord." Where do you need to do that? Brennan and Maria and the team up in Kimberly have been patiently waiting for God's leading. And after much prayer, their first standalone service is going to be in Kimberly on Easter Sunday, and we are so stoked for that. Yeah, give them a clap. And there were times where I wasn't patient during this process. I didn't wait for God's timing. I tried to force the issue. 3 years ago, you guys, we put all of this money and time and energy and social media campaigns and ordered a schwack of advertisers, invited all of Kimberly out to it, and we had 35 people attend, all from Cranbrook's gathering. Nobody knew. We're like, okay, we missed God's timing. Patience is key. And I'm so excited that this time is coming for them in a couple weeks. Joel and Dee have been so honoring and dedicated and patient, waiting on God's timing for when it is that they should start planning to plant a church. And their patience will pay off. And God is going to use them to do something truly wonderful in the kingdom. See, patience is a character trait that we must have to stay on the path that God has for us. 2, to be used by God actually requires humility, that we have to be humble. So you're David. You're this lowly shepherd boy, and all of a sudden you're chosen as king by this guy who has the power to choose such things. What is it that David, right after he is set in as king over Israel, do? He goes back to being a shepherd. He goes back to hanging out with the stinky sheep. He goes back to a life of isolation. And even when he did finally get called in to step up to the big plate, to head up to the palace, what is it that he did? Well, basically, he was performing music for the king whenever it is that he wanted. He was basically a human iPod. That's what it was. David be like, hey, David, play that song that I love. It's my favorite. The one that says Saul's the best and David is a loser. Again, play it again. Okay, again. Yeah, one more time. That's basically what it is that he did. It takes humility in order to be able to walk that out. What did he do when he was told to serve snacks to his older brothers? Well, he served snacks to his older brothers. See, he was somebody who understood that humility, that taking on the nature of a servant is what it is that makes somebody great. He was treated like a servant, and he understood that that was his calling for a time. And he communicated that when he said, "Who am I? Sovereign Lord, ruling Lord, King of Kings. Who am I? And what is my family that you have brought me this far?" This is when he's still just a meager servant. We had Paul and Priscilla Reed out last week. They encouraged leadership. We were so blessed by them. How many of you appreciated him? Man, he's so good, wasn't he? He had such awesome things to say about you folks, about our leadership team. He even had some nice things to say about me. But I recognize that I am still such a developing leader, that I have so far to go, that it only takes an opportunity to look at my past and realize how many people that I have hurt while being in leadership, to remember how humbly I need God. When I took over leading this church, we had about 50% of the people leave inside of the first year. They said, if Frank is leading, I am out. And I understood it. In fact, of the crew who were in the living room actually planting this church to begin with, the 30 to 40 people, there are really only about 3 or 4 left here still today. That's humbling. And I have so much more that I still need to learn. Thank goodness that we serve an awesome God who is willing to use broken vessels like us in order to do something special. Thank you for being a part of who it is that we are and what it is that we are called to. I recognize that so much of the success that we have seen here at Connect Church has really had very little to do with me and a lot to do with this team of people. I think one of my greatest gifts in the kingdom is the ability to just step aside and watch other people do great things, encouraging them to serve and lead and be who it is that God has called them to be. You are those gifts. Thank you. Next, that we are called to stay on the path to God's best for our life, and to do that, it requires courage. When Goliath, this big hulking beast of a guy, 9 feet tall, steps out onto the field and challenges any Israelite to come and face him, everybody was thinking, well, Saul, the king, it describes him as being 1 head taller than everybody else, would step up to it. But he didn't. He is quaking in his boots. He says, instead of him stepping out, it describes him as being dismayed and terrified, just like everybody else. But David, this young kid, kind of steps up and he has to comfort the king and say, hey, everything's going to be okay. It's all right, little fella. It's going to be okay. Not only that, he actually proves it. And we know he steps out onto the battlefield, kind of grabs a smooth rock, slaps it into the sling, gives it a whip, and boof, Goliath falls over dead. What gave him that kind of courage? David was brave and courageous because he knew that God had his back. He knew it. If you are on God's side, then there is nothing to fear, not even death. And sometimes I reflect on those amazingly courageous people. Folks like Sarah and Alex Marriott, who many of you don't even know, whom 6 years ago we sent out to Kelowna to plant a church. Folks like Brendan and Maria, who kind of up and took their family out of Cranbrook, leaving much of their family behind, much of their support system behind, in order to go to Kimberley and do something that is so much bigger than themselves, and they know it. And yet they have a courage that is overwhelming. Joel and Dee, who are going to pick up and leave. See, some of you folks even, who are having the courage to actually not just go, but also stay. Sometimes staying is harder than going, especially here. And yet we recognize that God is calling us to something. God has asked courage of me facing stage 4 cancer, asked courage of me to step away from a cushy kind of job where I get long summers and Christmases off and benefits, and instead work at the church. Woo woo. Which I love. We had to have courage to share our faith at times where it was awkward and weird. We had to have courage when our babies, both of them, almost died. We had to have courage when we were mocked and laughed at and gossiped about by friends and family members, even for our faith, and also family members for the calling that we believe God has for this church. Other churches and believers have said hurtful and downright hateful things about us because we were doing something that they didn't understand, something different. And yet so many of you folks have taken courage, led yourself, and had the audacity to actually believe that God has a plan and a call for your life and a plan and a call for this church. Though these giants might look different today, man, evils are still out there. Evils like selfishness and hate and insecurity and fear and loneliness. And to be honest, even other distractions that are okay. These things can become evil if they sway us off of the path that God is calling for our life. And so we must be vigilant. We must take courage. We must move forward with what it is that God has for our lives, for this life, for the life of this church. Man, I love the way David put it like this. He said, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom should I be afraid?" Next, to stay on the path, to be used by God, it requires faith. Throughout all of this, David showed that he had faith in God. He believed that God had a plan for his life and that he wanted to invite David into seeing God's plan come to fruition. Now, God had promised David that he would be king. And since he wasn't king yet, his believing in God and God's promises, he knew that Saul couldn't kill him. He knew that Goliath didn't have a chance. When others brought up doubts, David just pointed out the times in the past when God had been so faithful. That is so key for us. Are you keeping track of God's faithfulness so that in the future when you need it, you can call on how amazing he has come through time and time again? David trusted that God would continue to keep his promises, and that's really what faith is. You know, I shared a couple of weeks ago when suffering with pain and dealing with a cancer diagnosis that my faith in what it was that God was calling us to allowed us to journey through that differently than some folks. It didn't cause fear. It actually strengthened us and created a resolve in us to see what it is that God would have planned come to fruition. Why? Because we decided that we would walk humbly in God's grace. And his grace keeps us on the right path. You know, grace is just unmerited favor where we get something that we don't deserve. That's what grace is. And perhaps the most surprising thing about David being a man after God's own heart was that this guy's life was a train wreck. I mean, he's just as well known for his mistakes as he is his successes. This is someone who slept with the wife of one of his dear friends, tried to cover up the resulting pregnancy by having him killed, and then expected that the cover-up would work. He abused his power at times. He was an absentee and lousy father, would sometimes lie and manipulate as need arose in order to get what it is that he wanted. This ended up costing him so much. The respect of his sons, his wife, his followers, because he sowed dysfunction into his life, he began to reap dysfunction into his life. And yet, God still related to him. That's the crazy thing to me, and perhaps that says a lot more about God's character than it does about David's. You might think, why would God want anything to do with this lying, murderous adulterer? Really, it says a lot more about God, doesn't it? The one thing that David did that Saul didn't do was David was quick to recognize his faults, quick to repent, change his direction, change his thinking, and get back on the path that God had for him. See, being in God's will doesn't mean not making mistakes. It means being open about them and being quick to ask forgiveness, quick to learn from them, quick to change our thinking in regards to them, quick to do something different, to focus on what it is that God has for us. And David said this. He said, "I've sinned greatly in what it is that I've done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing." And we must walk in God's grace and stay on the path, because foolish things have consequences. You know, this church has been on the brink of closing its doors so many times, I have begun to lose track. I mean, even in the early days, Dwayne, when we would like sit around and go, okay, there's 10 of us around the table here. We've got to come up with the extra $3,000. What the heck are we going to do? And you just kind of pull out the wallet and you begin to go, okay, here we go. Let's write a check. Let's figure this thing out. There have been so many times where we didn't have enough volunteers in order to be able to do what it is that God has called us to do. Why do we scrape together money? Why do we scrape together time and energy? Because we want to have a coffee station? Because we want to have a building where people can meet? No. We have a faith that those things are tools in order to achieve what it is that God is calling us to do. Because we believe that God has called us to reach out to this community, to reach out to this region, to reach out to the world with the amazing news of who Jesus is and how much he loves us. This is something bigger than ourselves, something worth laying down your life for. We have a faith that God is calling us to greater influence, greater impact, greater trust, greater love. And the cool thing about this faith is that as we believe God for greater and more, God actually becomes greater and more in our own lives. David, when he was surrounded by trouble and difficulty, put it well when he said this. He said, "But I am trusting you, O Lord, saying, you are my God. My future is in your hands. Rescue me from those who hunt me down relentlessly." See, Satan is out to stop us. Our own brokenness and dysfunction is out to stop us. Yet if we have faith and we persevere, our calling as a church will not be stopped. We will bring love and hope and healing and faith to the gates of hell, and the gates of hell will not stand against them or hold back God's goodness. It can't. But foolish things, sin, has consequences. And as you sow, as you plant, so you shall reap, so you shall harvest. So don't keep making stupid choices, because it will catch up with you. But repenting and asking God's forgiveness helps point you back to a better path. God's calling leads us towards his best for our life. But it's our character choices that actually keep us on the path. It's a lot like a dartboard. The actual word sin actually comes from an archery term. I don't know how many of you know that, but whenever somebody didn't actually hit the bull's eye that they put up there, somebody would yell out, "Sin," which means you just missed the mark. And so even in terms of our life, God gives us a purpose and a calling. And the good news is that if we understand our purpose, we understand our calling, we can begin to hit the mark. That was a 20. Oh. And the good news is, as we continue to step forward, we begin to move even closer. That was a 1. We begin to move even closer. That was a bull. We begin to move even closer. We begin to move even closer. And as we step forward and we stay on the path, it gets easier and easier in order to achieve God's will for our life. But the opposite is also true, that if we begin to understand God's calling on our life, but we have character issues, then it suddenly begins to get just a little bit harder. Let's say we're impatient, right? And so we don't have the patience that God is calling us to do. And so we're just like, okay, suddenly I am suckier at what it is that I am doing, right? It's less easy for me to stay and hit the mark. It's a lot easier for me to miss the bullseye and sin, right? Let's say that I'm filled with pride and humility is not my way, where it's like, man, I got this. I don't even, you know what? I don't even need to, yeah, I'm supposed to go that way, but I don't even need to see. Right? It's all good. I got this. No problem. How'd I do? When I turn my back on God's plan, when I try to do it on my own, sin becomes a reality, and I just miss the mark really badly, right? Even if I do things like lack courage, and fear starts to settle in. So like, I can't watch. These character things get in the way of us hitting the mark with our life. That these things stop us from achieving what it is that God has called us to do. So we have to get these character things in line. Certainly God's calling and direction is something that is exciting. But to be honest, it is your character that actually keeps you moving towards it and helps you hit the mark. Saul lacked character, and his prideful nature caused him to miss the mark over and over and over again. And so he lost his secondary calling, to be used by God for something special. David made regular stupid choices, and as he sowed dysfunction in his marriage and his kingdom, they were taken away. But even David's son Solomon, who was considered the wisest man to ever live, watched his dad's example and chose not to learn from it. He let his character faults of sexual dysfunction cause him to lose his kingdom, to cause it to split up into something that it was never supposed to be. This is the wisest man who ever lived, who was tripped up as a result of a lack of character. His rule was taken away. So we should learn from those people. Learn from Saul, learn from David, learn from Solomon. That we should be focusing on our obedience and working on those character things that might cause us to trip up. Allow Jesus to work in those areas that he still needs to work in. We're all tempted away from the path. We are. We're all tempted away from our call. When we lack patience, when we lack humility, when we lack courage, when we lack faith, when we lack grace. These are love-based character qualities that we're called to be patient with others. We're called to think of others as better, as higher than ourselves. We're called to trust and believe. Think the best of other people. Believe God's love for us. Have a little faith. See, the promise of rewarded love is grace. Jesus came with his love and offered us a fresh start. Those who love God and who guard their heart, man, God does something special in that life. Those who love God are rewarded with a life of meaning, a life of fulfillment, a life beyond anything they could ever possibly imagine, a life of purpose. But our character keeps us on the path. So work on your character and ask God to do the same. Father, I thank you for what it is that you taught us. I thank you that we can learn from somebody else's mistakes. Father, I thank you that we can also learn from our own mistakes. Some of us probably already know what our character faults are. It may not even be these 5 that I talked about here this morning. But it may be. There are things that are getting in the way of your best for our life. Will you just bring those to mind right now? Father, I thank you that this is not for condemnation, but so that we might be able to repent and change. That we might be able to start fresh. That we might be able to remove the blinders, open our eyes, turn around, and see what it is that you have called for us. Father, help us walk into our calling. Will you please forgive us for sometimes succumbing to our sinful, selfish nature by getting sucked into regular habits and hang-ups that would stray us off the path. Father, will you give us a sense of healing in whatever that area is of dysfunction? Will you give us a sense of freedom in that area as a result of what it is that Jesus did on the cross? Will you help us understand that we are part of your grand story, that you have a special assignment for us, that when you knitted us together in our mother's womb, that you had a plan for our life. Father, help us better know what that is, and then help keep us on the path by helping us deal with our character faults. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.